Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabby Ballard, and I am a third-year undergraduate student studying computer science and anthropology. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Black Students Union, where I serve as the head of the Political Action Committee. I'd like to be the first to welcome you to our event, MIT and the Legacy of Slavery, reviewing the early findings. Today, we have two amazing sets of panelists to illuminate for us the history of this institution's relationship with slavery. After the panels, we'll have time for a brief Q&A. We realize that this may be a lot to process, so we encourage you to ask many questions. You can submit questions via Twitter at this hashtag MIT and slavery. If you include that in your tweet, then we'll be able to see them. You can also, we'll also have time for people to ask questions in real life. I hope you all bring open minds and willingness to act responsibly in light of the information you learn here. Without further ado, I'd like to release the podium to our president, President Rafael Reif.
Thank you, Gabby. Let me just say something to honor our Shas Dean, Melissa Nobles. Good afternoon. That's what she wanted. Thank you, Gabby, for your introduction and also for your leadership of the BSU. I also am grateful, I'm really grateful that the BSU and the BGSA collaborated so closely with Vice President Kirk Collenbrander and my office to bring this event together today. To our audience, delighted to see so many of you. Thank you so much for joining us today as we begin this very important exploration. Let me also extend a warm welcome to everyone taking part remotely via live stream. We're here to launch an effort that we're calling MIT and the Legacy of Slavery. As we begin this work, I want to thank all of the members of our community who have brought us this far and who will continue to help us with their guidance. At the top of that list are Professor Craig Wilder, Archivist Nora Murphy, Teaching Assistant Clare Kim, and everyone involved in the MIT and Slavery course, especially the students. I'm extremely grateful for and extremely proud of the work you're all doing for our community. On behalf of the entire MIT community, I also want to express our deep gratitude to Shas Dean Melissa Nobles, who already has a big and hard job, but who nevertheless agreed to lead the effort for the next phase of our community conversation. And for that, I thank you. And I believe this is also a perfect moment to thank the many students, faculty, and staff who have over decades worked to make MIT more equitable and more inclusive. In particular, I want to thank all those whose efforts helped inspire the MIT and Slavery class. I see many of you here today, and I thank you. To frame our discussion, let me offer just a little context. Last spring, I asked Professor Wilder to recommend the best way for MIT to explore its historical links to the institution of slavery. In response, Craig provided us with a remarkable tool for uncovering the facts: an ongoing undergraduate primary research course. With this new tool, MIT students will help create a more complete history of MIT, a version that examines the more painful human realities along with the technical and scientific achievements. I'm thrilled that the participants in last fall's course will share the highlights of their findings today. And I believe the work of this class about our past is also important to the present and the future. Something I've always loved and admired about the MIT community is that we seek and we face facts. If in this case we have the courage to look at even the most unflattering and disturbing parts of our history, I believe we have a much better chance of approaching the present and the future with humility and self-awareness too. For example, 150 years from now, how will the MIT community then look at how we are conducting ourselves today? What will shock or disappoint them? And what can history teach us as we work to invent the future? In the words of one of the students, Mahi Elango, technology is never neutral. So how can we make sure that the technologies we invent today will indeed contribute tomorrow to making a better world for all? It's clear that we have a great deal to learn and reflect on together. So let's get started. Craig, Melissa, Nora, would you please join me on the stage? Melissa, let me, is the mic on? You hear me?
Yep.
Melissa, let me start with you.
Okay.
I briefly said something about history a moment ago, but can you give us some more historical context of the course and what we're going through today?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'd like to provide, actually, briefly, two historical contexts. The first is about the recent developments at other colleges and universities around the country that have to, in their examination of their relationship to slavery. And then the second is the larger historical context of the US at the time of MIT's founding in 1861. So, the first. So over the past 20 years or so, many US colleges and universities have undertaken studies to delve into their historical relationships to slavery. Brown University was the first to launch such an investigation back in 2001 under then President Ruth Simmons. Then after that effort, there was a lull in activity. In the meantime, Craig's book, Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of American Universities, was published in 2013. And in a really important way, Craig's book was revolutionary. It changed the conversation, in fact, reinvigorated a conversation. And his book, in very important ways, contextualized Brown's efforts by showing that our country's oldest institutions of higher education had been entangled with slavery. In other words, Brown was not alone. Slave labor was used to build campuses. The money generated by the slave trade and by slave ownership was used to finance those institutions. And a number of faculty members at colleges and universities around the country used their positions to help develop the intellectual arguments needed to justify slavery. The MIT and Slavery website, class website, provides a list of colleges and universities that today have undertaken these historical studies. And I encourage you to take a look at the website. You will notice that many of the universities and colleges are not in the South. In fact, they are here in the Northeast, and they include some of our country's the oldest and most prestigious universities. So this observation leads to my second contextual point, which is the larger historical context. So at the start of the Civil War in 1861, our country's economy, politics, and social order were fundamentally shaped by the institution of slavery. We were, in the words of one historian, a slave nation. And here are just a few facts that help illustrate the truth of that description. So, as we know, before the Civil War, the country was divided. Of the 34 states then in the Union, 19 were free and 15 were slaveholding. Cotton grown in the slaveholding southern states was the country's leading export. It helped to fuel the manufacturing revolution here in New England, principally in Lowell, Massachusetts, and in Europe. It paid for all manner of American imports, including steel. It was a major source of capital. Slaves represented represented more capital than any other asset except for land. So it was basically slaves and land. And the American government was dominated by pro-slavery interests. So abolitionists here in Boston principally would rail against the slave power. And what they meant was the evident power that pro-slavery interests and slaveholders wielded in the national government. Part of that power was derived from the Constitution itself, with the 3/5 clause, which meant that for the purposes of political representation, slaves counted as 3/5 persons. But it went beyond the Congress. It also included the chief executive, the presidents. So of the 16 presidents from Washington to Lincoln, 10 owned slaves, and several of them, including Presidents Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Jackson, owned slaves while they served as president. So I provide that context as a way of offering a framework for our better understanding the findings of the class. And with that, I'll turn it over to Craig.
So indeed, with that historical context, how did the course work? I mean, how did you put it together? How did it happen? And from the facts you have unearthed so far, what do you think is the most relevant to us? What should be important to this community?
Sure. I think to how the course comes about, there's an honest answer and a dishonest answer, and so I'll give the dishonest one first. You turned to us and asked us what we should do, and I thought, the way for us to move forward was an undergraduate research course, taking advantage of the thing that we do best, and particularly the thing that we do best in Chance, which is teaching and using these moments to actually challenge our students to produce the kinds of knowledge that we know they're capable of. And so we learned from, in fact, what was happening at a lot of other universities. I've been visiting a lot of them. We stole the best of their ideas, and then we did things that were peculiarly MIT. We have an extraordinarily well-trained, excellent and accessible libraries and archives, professional staff. And so one of the things I wanted to do was to start there, to really actually wed the class to the archives and create this as a kind of joint project moving forward. I didn't tell the libraries that. I sort of came to them with this design, and they were extraordinarily gracious in actually partnering with us. And so that's where that part of the class comes from. But the more honest answer was, I sat down with a piece of paper and I started thinking about what we do best and how we should do it, which is exactly what I just described. And then I turned to the history department staff, because nothing happens here without our administrators actually making it happen, our staff making it happen. And so the history department staff, Mabel Chin and Megan Pepin, who got us our course approval, got us our course number, actually got us into the catalog, did all the advertising for us. We went live the week that students were registering for classes. And so we didn't have a class until that moment, and they made that happen. And so really one of the things we wanted to do with the class was to sort of take us from there, and then sort of what was the educational goals of the class. There were things that we already knew about MIT's relationship to slavery. And just to describe it very quickly, one of the things that we knew was that there was an engineering revolution in the United States in the 4 decades before the Civil War. Somewhere between about 1819 and the 1860s, there's an extraordinary growth of engineering schools in the Northeast. And that's in fact driven by the slave economy. What's happening in the Northeast is that the products of slavery, slave-grown cotton from the South, coming into the commodities markets of New York, the first great commodity actually in the commodities exchange is cotton. And then being funneled into or transported into New England, where it's turned into textiles. And cotton manufacturers need engineers. They need engineers to build factories, to maintain and build machines. They need design. They're seeking out competitive advantages in the marketplace. And so they begin pouring money into engineering. In the mid-Atlantic, it's sugar grown by enslaved people in the Caribbean that's actually pouring into places like Brooklyn, which will create Brooklyn as the region of the United States that comes to dominate the entire sugar economy of the world in the 19th century. The first monopoly, when the United States Congress begins investigating monopolies, is in fact the Brooklyn Sugar Trust. And that group of families that own those sugar refineries begin pouring money into what becomes the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, now part of NYU. And so in the decades before the war, there is in fact this extraordinary revolution in engineering that's driven by the slave economy. And in some ways, MIT is the culmination of that story. Our founding in 1861 positions us in, I think, a unique way to think about slavery. Not just the way in which slavery transformed and shaped the American economy and the realities of higher education, but the way in which slavery reached past the Civil War into the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, and fundamentally transformed the nation that we became.
Do you anticipate perhaps the course to evolve into doing some historical comparisons and assessing, in addition to getting fact-finding, assessing, analyzing, and reflecting the way both of you just did?
I think so. One of the things that we're interested in is we always knew that the class would have to grow in multiple directions. We'd have to take different historical angles. And one of the things I was reluctant to do was to write the history of other institutions. I don't think it's fair for us to do that, although those other institutions are part of our story. And so what we've been doing instead is reaching out to our kindred institutions, the other engineering and technical schools founded before and during the Civil War, and partnering with them to create a consortium of engineering and science schools that are studying their relationship to slavery. And so far we've gotten extraordinarily excited feedback on that, and we're looking to actually have our first meetings this spring and a conference probably next year.
I don't know if my mic is on, is, here at MIT, we're known obviously for science and technology. But as the Dean of SHAS, the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, part of my job is to help ground, contextualize that kind of learning. And in a certain way, we constantly say that the world is more than science and technology. In fact, it exists within human conditions, and it is in fact a reflection of human endeavor. But this helps us look at it in yet another way. So it's not merely talking about the importance of science and technology today, as important as it is, but this allows us to look critically back at that question in a very important part of our country's history. So I think it provides a lot of ways of better understanding the nature of a science and technology education, in addition to helping us better understand our country's history and its relationship to slavery.
I agree. It's really an interesting moment for us when I hear you, both of you, speak and you talk about the labor, the economy, the engineering, the combination of all those things 150 plus years ago and what we're actually undergoing today. So we can learn a great deal, not just from our history in terms of the facts, but from what it means to the present. Exactly. Nora, what made you go to look at the Virginia census documents? I mean, what drove you in that direction, and what did you find?
I blame the class, partly. We met one day with Philip Alexander, who's author of A Widening Sphere, A History of MIT. And he said to us, at Rogers' memorial service, Major Jedediah Hotchkiss spoke. And when he spoke, he referred to Levi, Rogers' Negro serving man. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Who's Levi? So it set me on a path of looking for this person. And I looked at the Society of Arts minutes, and sure enough, at the memorial, there are 2 references to Levi in there. And one of the references is that Levi is giving a tour of the geology of Virginia to Charles Daubney, who is a French geologist and visiting. Rogers was ill and unable to give the tour himself, so Levi gave the tour. That still didn't provide a lot of information because it was simply Levi was in the household or knew Rogers, he met with Daubney. So I thought about what we might have. I looked at some of the correspondence we have of William Barton Rogers, his papers, didn't find any references there. But in the published work, Life and Letters of William Barton Rogers, which is his correspondence that his widow, Emma Savage Rogers, published after his death, there was one reference to Levi. And it was in January 1838. And in that letter, Rogers talks about Levi coming in to the drawing room to tell him that one of the horses had died, and that both men were upset by this. But the letter goes on, and it's a letter William has written to his brother Robert, and he says, and I'm very excited to hear that you enjoyed your visit with Daubney as well. So it begins to put a place that three men are in the same location in Virginia in late 1837, 1838. So I know that Rogers and Levi were together at that time. So how to find out any more? I thought of the census records. I've been an archivist for a very long time and am aware of how to use the records. So it took a little digging, going through various census records. But the 1850 census for Virginia, when Rogers and his bride, Emma, were there and living at UVA with his brother Robert and his wife, I found them all there. That was good, in line with all the other faculty at UVA, and then realized that there was a slave schedule that was also done at the same time, which was compiled both in 1850 and 1860. So I looked at the slave schedule, and there, as head of household, is William Barton Rogers, and it lists 6 enslaved people in the household. What this means, I don't know anything beyond that, other than we have a list of, I think it's 3 females and 3 males, a little boy who's 10, and the others are adults. So there's more work for the students to do, for the class to do, to see what we can find out about these people, who they are, if we can get any more detail. The census does not give any names for them. It only gives ages and gender. So I said to Dean Nobles one day, if you send an historian, MIT students, and an archivist on a path, we find all sorts of things. You're all welcome to use the archives for any questions, anytime.
It's actually riveting. It's fascinating. I mean, when you put the emotion aside to see how you're learning about all this, it's just, and it's all here.
Right.
Just nobody had the time or the interest to look into that. Craig, Nora just mentioned, she already mentioned something about perhaps what the students could do this semester, but she's already suggested something, but what do you have in mind for the class going forward? I mean, how do you envision that continuing?
The peculiarities of the MIT class design were first the partnership with the archive, that Nora and I would teach the class together, that the class would actually be embedded in the archive, but also that it would be a 2-semester course. The students don't have to take both semesters, but the fall semester is focused on sort of deep dives into MIT's history. The students defining their own research topics and then finding out as much about those topics as they possibly can, or inheriting topics from previous students after this year. And then the spring semester actually the focus is a little bit different. I think it's peculiar to us, it's unique to us. Rather than having the students turn over their research at the end of the semester to the faculty members and the graduate student who are working with them, and we produce the material, the narrative for the website, we're actually asking the students to do that. In the spring semester, the students actually do the work of editing, thinking about the presentation of and the production of the material for the website, everything from the narrative and editorial decisions to decisions about the kinds of images and documents that should attend that narrative. Or in other words, I want to make real the claim that we began with, that this was MIT students rewriting the history of MIT for MIT. And we want that to be true from the first research step to the final publication launch.
Well, we're going to listen here. We're going to hear the students in a moment. In fact, we're a little bit behind the schedule to hear the students. But before we introduce them, following up on Craig's question, Melissa, how would you envision, how would you like to see this conversation evolving? What would you like to see moving forward?
Sure. So I'm going to make good use of the expert that we have here in Craig. And he given his experience of going around and looking and working at other universities and how they've dealt with the findings of their studies. And one of the things he advised me, and I'm listening very closely, which was that he said, listen to everyone, be open-minded and invite conversation, and listen closely. So I intend to do that. And in the coming weeks, I expect to bring together a group of folks who will help me think about how we move forward with this. So I say to everyone who's interested, stay tuned. But it will certainly be an effort of listening and gathering ideas and comments and reactions and such. You know, my one hope, though, the spirit that I think I encourage us to embark on this journey is this. You know, we're looking at old things with new eyes, and I hope we take that sense of curiosity and commitment to learning the truth and taking that forward, and working together in a mutually respectful way. If we're able to do that, I'm confident that this will be it is important for MIT, will continue to be more important, and we can be a model for other universities who I expect will begin to take up this charge.
Nicely said, Melissa. Look, let me just say that I will introduce the students now, but let me just say that we all really owe these three individuals a huge debt of gratitude. I mean, what Craig came up with something remarkable, our own students writing our own history in a course, I mean, in a technological institution. I mean, which is where they need to really learn. It's remarkable. The Nobles helping us to figure out what is the right way to have this conversation. And Nora doing this amazing research that you remind me of my days in the lab, except that this is a different kind of lab, the one that you were doing. So please all just give a good round of applause to thank. Now I'll introduce the students who, I mean, they claim the credit, but the students actually did the work. So let's hear it from the students and the TA. I'm going to introduce them all to come and join me on the stage. Unfortunately, my schedule doesn't allow me to stay until the end, so I'm going to be probably a little until 2 o'clock or so, and I have to leave. But I cannot miss. I heard that some of this already. I want to hear it again. It's really riveting. It's really worth paying attention to how they went about and how did they decide, each of them, to do what they wanted to do. So, in that order, Claire, Alaisha, Mahi, Kelvin, and Charlotte, please join me on stage.
Good afternoon. So I'm actually going to take up a little time here today before you hear from the student presentations. And what I want to do is actually take time to really elaborate and describe the work that we were doing in the classroom. And the reason why I want to emphasize the work and the skills that the students developed over the course of the semester is because it's really out of our collaborative, engaged discussions that they were able to develop the vocabulary, the ways of thinking, of framing their historical research projects that you're going to hear today. And so I really want to underscore that. And one of the biggest and most daunting problems that the students had to come up with is, how do you craft a historical narrative out of the research that you have? And I do want to highlight this one particular memory that I have, where the students recognized how daunting that would be, and silence filled the room. So Alaisha, I remember, leaned back in her chair. Both Mahi and Charlotte both crouched on their computers, and Kelvin was just sitting there, and he was the one to break the silence. He burst out into a grin and said, "Don't worry, guys, we got this." So I was very excited by how receptive they were to learning very quickly the different strategies that you could use to craft the stories that you're about to hear. And there were different ways we approached that. So we looked at various literatures on the histories of MIT and slavery, and we really dissected it. We looked at what decisions that the scholars had made in order to forward the arguments, to forward the stories, and think about the implications. And in our collective discussions, the students really came, there was a moment of recognition where we all recognized that we needed to interrogate our assumptions about both MIT and slavery, but also race, science, and technology. So one of the readings that we had done was to look at the history of the slave ship. And the students conducted amazing, sophisticated, multiple readings of it, recognizing that it was not just a vessel of transportation, it was not just a feat of engineering, It was also a site of violence. It was a prison. There were these multiple layers that we needed to come to terms with. So I'm really proud of you guys for that. So not to take too much time away, I do want to conclude actually with a task for the audience members here today and for those who are listening in on the live stream. So when you listen to these histories and these stories and presentations that you're about to hear, I would like to ask that you not just passively receive it. After these presentations, whenever you go back to your laboratory, when you go back to your office at MIT, I want you to take time to look at your environment, look at the scientific objects you're working with, and really consider how the language, practices, your thinking and approach to, or thinking about MIT science and technology actually include traces of the histories that you're about to hear today. Thank you. I forgot to introduce the next speaker, actually. So for our first presentation, actually, it's my pleasure to welcome Charlotte Minsky to the podium, who will be talking about the presence of Southern students at MIT in its early formative years.
Hello. So as Claire said, my name is Charlotte Minsky, and my research was investigating early Southern students at MIT and trying to look at the origin story of MIT that we're told and reevaluate it in the context of the Civil War. So I started my research by going through the course catalogs for the first 15 years of MIT classes. So this was from 1865 to 1881. And I pulled out the name of every student from the South during this period. And what we have here is the 29 students from the South who attended MIT during these first 15 years. Now, looking at the demographics of these students, in general, they were evenly distributed between different locations in the South. And so for the most part, we'd see 1 or 2 students from each city, one from Macon, 1 from Atlanta, but no more than 2 students per city, except for the unique case of Louisville, Kentucky. 11 of the 29 students were all from Louisville. So in contrast to just 1 or 2 students from all the other cities, this immediately struck me as a surprisingly disproportionate representation. And I wanted to investigate why this might have been. Looking more at the broader demographics of these Southern students, it's clear that there's a disproportionate representation, not just from the city of Louisville in particular, but from the border states at large. So Kentucky, Missouri, and these other border states constituted a surprisingly large portion of the students from the South overall. And this makes sense because these border states were playing a very unique role in America's history during this post-Civil War time. So there are several reasons why Louisville and the border states might have been particularly poised to send students to get a technical education at MIT. And here are a few of the possible factors. Louisville in particular had a unique role in the slave trade. If you look at the demographics of Louisville prior to the Civil War, you see that unlike a lot of other cities in the South, its percentage of enslaved residents was actually declining rather than increasing. So at first glance, it seems like Louisville was less connected to the slave economy than other Southern cities. But looking closer, you can see that although the standing enslaved population was decreasing, there was a really large number of slaves being transported through Louisville, being sold down south on the Ohio River. And Louisville had a really important place in this slave trade. And so Louisville was able to benefit economically from the slave economy, but didn't have to undergo the same demographic and labor shifts after the Civil War as other more agriculturally based Southern cities. The second unique thing about Louisville was its railroad industry. Because Louisville's economy and strategic position was so dependent on its place on the Ohio River, as waterways became less important in the American transportation economy and railroads emerged as a more dominant method of transportation, Louisville was heavily motivated to invest in the railroad industry, and so it was a center of really developing railroad infrastructure. The third way that Louisville was sort of unique in the South was that it benefited from Union occupation during the Civil War. And so this is something that also speaks to the broader ability of border states to send students to get a technical education, is because unlike other cities in the South which were destroyed by the Civil War, they actually had military money flowing in from the Union and were more protected during the war. Finally, the border states in general had social and institutional ties to the North that were not as severed during the Civil War as states and cities deeper south. And so all of these are just possible contributors to why Louisville and the border states might have had a stronger connection to MIT and sent more students to get a technical education in these post-war years. In order to investigate further this disproportionate representation and just get an idea of the relationship between the South and MIT during this time, I looked closer at 3 students: Nelson Whitney Conant, Ernest Saltmarsh, and Joshua Breed. These were the first 3 Southern students to attend MIT for 4 or more years, so the period we consider an undergraduate education. What I did for these 3 students is I reconstructed sort of an overview of their career trajectories after they graduated from MIT. So this is just a list of all of the jobs that these students held after their graduation. And I don't know if it jumps out to you immediately, but what jumped out to me was the presence of railroads in all of these students' occupations. I was surprised that out of the first 3 students I chose to look at, not only were all of them involved in the railroad industry, but the railroad industry seemed to really dominate their post-graduation trajectories. Looking more broadly at the students graduating during this time, this trend of being involved in the railroads was not just limited to these 3 students, and it was not just limited to Southern students. The railroad industry was the #1 specific industry or occupation that students went to from 1865 to 1887. And looking at the United States in this period, this absolutely makes sense. This is a map of the railroad system in the United States in 1861, so just before the Civil War. And I just want to point out to you, Louisville, you can see over here, is a really important node for connecting the northern railway system to the southern railway system. So this just speaks to the unique sort of role of Louisville and its advantage in this developing economy. So in this post-war period, we see the development of railroads as really one of the engines of Reconstruction. And there's a ton of federal, state level, and institutional money flowing into the railroad industry. So it absolutely makes sense that students getting an engineering technical education at MIT were going into this economy that had so much funding into it and was really part of the post-Civil War infrastructure building that was so characteristic of the United States during this time. So what this research shows is that there's a perception that we often have of the North and the South of the United States as culturally, socially, and economically disparate areas. And this research is showing that not only is this absolutely not true, but that MIT in particular was a frontier of the exchange of people, resources, and education and ideas between these locations. There was a flow from Louisville and border states to MIT, and there was a flow of MIT education and MIT people back into the South and back into the railroad economy. Really, the story of MIT is the story of Reconstruction. And it is central to MIT's origin story that it was growing up in this period of post-Civil War economy. Thank you. For our next presentation, I am proud to invite Alaisha Alexander to the podium.
Oh, goodness. So when I was starting the class, I was really interested in the culture that was emerging at MIT at that time, specifically around discussions about slavery and its connections with race. And in sort of looking into these kinds of histories and the way that we talked about slavery and the way that we talked about race, there were also different kinds of things that were emerging where there were very absent conversations. The first of these is MIT's reception of the slave ship. So to give a bit of context, this story does not start with MIT and starts actually several decades before with the Song Massacre, originally known as the Song Incident. For those who aren't familiar, this incident occurred when a crew coming to deliver slaves into Jamaica mistook Jamaica's shores for the shores of Hispaniola and went several hundred miles before realizing their mistake. In turning around, they encountered a typhoon, and low on rations, they realized that they would not make it to Jamaica with the crew that they had on board, and decided to throw off the cargo in order to save the rest of the crew. Just to be incredibly clear, this cargo was indeed the slaves on the ship. They were not concerned about dropping the cargo because the cargo was indeed insured, and they dropped several hundred of the slaves off the ship on their way back to Jamaica and returned back home without incident. When they did return, the insurance company had issues with paying out the compensation for the slaves, and when brought to Parliament, the conversation then shifted to whether this should be a case of mass murder or should be an insurance case. It was eventually decided that this would be treated as an insurance case, and the company was properly compensated for their insured cargo. In 1840, J.M.W. Turner created this painting, Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On, to depict his interpretation of the massacre that occurred. It's a traditional romantic maritime painting, and what was very, very prominent about this painting is the shifting of colors at the top from light to dark, and obviously the boat in the background. And what I also found particularly striking was that the waves at the bottom that show the hands and the blood and the reaching out and the eating of all these different fish and sharks of the bodies in the water take up about a third of the painting. But what was really peculiar about the painting and its prominence is that critiques all throughout the 19th century fail to mention have no mention of any of the slaves in the water and refer to them only as symbols and as depictions of death, but not necessarily as human bodies. In January 1882, this painting appeared as an imitation in the architect's drawing room. This was a pretty big deal because the architects were kind of the cool kids of the time. The architects not only had the larger spaces of MIT, they also had a drawing room that sat amongst the most prominent professors and some of the more nicer areas. When commentary about the piece emerged, specifically within the students, all of the commentary focused on the architects. The first talking particularly about the broad strokes of the piece and the colors and the tech. Another from an angry civil engineer about how architects get so many nice things, including this painting, not mentioning the content and only the clarity of the piece. And finally, another complaint about the architects and their nice things. Most of the conversations circling MIT and most of the conversations circling this piece at MIT are talk about the technique, talk about the brushstrokes, and talk about the artist, but fail to mention the incident that it was inspired by or the actual content of the piece. And what I felt was very powerful about this fact is that it's not just about what's there, it's also about what isn't. When talking about more explicit slave terminology at MIT, I found a couple of really interesting examples. The first being here on the right, or left, my right, of the very, very first edition of the tech, and also on the influence of different artists like Arthur de Gobineau on the different literature that students were reading and was influencing their science. So the first one here by Arthur D. Little of the class of '84, he talks about the behavior of ants. This seemingly innocent article that talks a bit about how the ants interact with each other, how they grow, how they move around and create all these very intricate pieces, explicitly talks about how different species of ants should tend towards slave behaviors and essentially indicates the thinking of this person as someone who feels that slavery is a natural part of nature. The idea that people were coming from different species, polygenism, was very, very prevalent during this time. And so it's not exactly a stretch to feel as though the way that people were thinking about their science was influenced by how they were thinking about slavery. So early courses at MIT actually included a good amount of courses that talked about race science and sociology. And ethnology specifically. In course 4 in architecture, they were required to have an anatomy class or anatomy equivalent course. And in 1882, they changed this from any anatomy equivalent course into and pulled influences from a Harvard Medical School course. This Harvard Medical School course had a whole host of different writings, but one of the more prominent writings of the course was by Arthur de Gobineau. He wrote the essay on the inequality of human races. This very extensive essay essentially ranks humans in 3 categories: black, yellow, and white, and within that has a hierarchy with the Aryan race of the white being the highest and the lowest being the darkest of the Negroids. This was taught in an anatomy class to better frame and give context to these students about how they should depict certain kinds of people and how they should go about drawing and creating those people. Also in biology, they had strong influences from powerful figures within their bibliography. The Harvard biologist and geologist Lewis, actually, his papers were very, very prominent in the validation of slavery as a moral argument, essentially stating that that particular race was essentially incapable of governing themselves, and that the human race does not strictly evolve from one ancestor, but several, some more evolved than others before the eventual mixing of these species. And finally, Benjamin Silliman, who was a Yale chemist and also one of the founders of the Connecticut Colonization Society. The Connecticut Colonization Society was an abolitionist society that thought that once the slaves were freed, they should be sent back to Africa, Liberia specifically, and created several funds in order to do that, though they never actually succeeded. He was a Yale chemist, and even though he was a prominent abolitionist, he kept slaves in his own home several years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and once they were finally officially freed, kept them as indentured servants in his home for the rest of their natural lives. Finally, in Course 9 in General Studies, this was a more mild interpretation of race science by MIT's own Dr. William Ripley. He essentially states that race, properly speaking, is responsible only for those peculiarities, mental and bodily, which are transmitted with constancy along the lines of direct physical descent from father to son. And what was really interesting about his take on this was that he essentially asserted that even though genetics plays a very particular role in how humans develop, he also stated that culture and nurture has a lot to also do with that. Though his stance was more mild within his course, he included several of these other influences and doesn't have any other literature that goes against the idea that the darker people were inferior. What I found was just really interesting about all of these influences was that the things that people think are not absent from their science. Science is not neutral, technology is not neutral, and all of these students that they are teaching, that they are putting out into the world, who travel to the South and to several parts of the North and even the West, take these ideas with them, not just from their humanities courses, but also from their science courses. And these, and the way that they validate these ways of thinking can even be seen in how we approach different science today. So, like Claire said, as you go back to your labs, I encourage you to challenge your assumptions and also to think about where your different notions of science come from. Thank you. It is my privilege to introduce Mahi to the stage to speak a bit more on her research from the class.
Hello. So my research this past semester has been exploring the early MIT curriculum and the circulation of ideas right after the end of the Civil War. So in particular, I'm asking questions such as, what are students and faculty members teaching and learning and talking about in the context of an entirely new host of issues post-slavery, such as labor, productivity, engineering advances, and the pedagogy of these issues. So not only are we talking, or these students and faculty members talking and circulating these ideas, these MIT graduates are actually contributing back to the field, right? They are entering the labor force. They are the ones advancing engineering and talking about methods of production. So I want to begin with the motto of MIT, right? The mind and the hand. And the mind represents in what I think is the civic and moral education, and the hand represents the technical and vocational education. And I wanted to ask the question of how well does MIT's early curriculum actually reflect MIT's motto? And so to really understand the intersection of these two types of education, I focused on the mining and metallurgy department, which was established in 1865. This department is particularly interesting for a few reasons. The first is that it embodied the core principles of the mind and the hand quite well, as we'll see later in my presentation. The department was also the pride of MIT. William Barton Rogers was a geologist by profession, and the mining engineering department actually started as a department of geology. And third, outside of non-agricultural occupations, so few occupations made use of slaves as universally and for such a long time as the mining of coal and production of iron. So I wanted to look at the typical mining student, what they're doing in 1873. So these are all required classes that on the left, the third-year student would need to take, and on the right, the fourth-year student would need to take. If you look at the top, there's quite a lot of mention of field practice and laboratory practice, right? So these students are certainly developing the technical and vocational education. You'll see that the field practice actually refers to mining excursions that students would take during the summer, starting in 1871. And especially in 1873, these students are going to coal mines in California, Nevada, Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania. So they're traveling all across the nation, and these students are seeing firsthand post-slavery labor forms. So not only are they discussing these in class, reading these from textbooks, but they're also seeing it in person. And in addition, these students are practicing this production of iron and coal in labs. So our second president, President Runkle, instituted what he called instruction shops that would create a systematic and thorough way for students to truly understand the ways in which mine and coal are produced. He ensured that students would not only learn these techniques as like apprentices when it was beneficial to employers when these students need to learn, but would actually understand a systematic way of these practices that, again, I would like to reemphasize that they're actually seeing in person when they're visiting these coal mines year after year. And the third part that's interesting, and circling back to the other half of curriculum, which is the mind and civic and moral education that these students are gaining, is on the left-hand side, you'll see logic, right? The systematic treatment of formal logic, and on the right-hand side, political economy. So in 1876, President Runkle convinced a few faculty members and their wives and got a group of people to go to the exhibition in Philadelphia, which was the first in the United States. And so this is the first time that MIT is promoting itself on the international stage. And in his words, the pride of MIT were excursions to mining regions and manufacturing works, because this was unique. No other institution in the past had encouraged the students to actually see these, the forms and labor forms actually in practice. And again, emphasis on actual mining and metallurgical laboratories that students are, again, learning and doing by themselves. And so tie back. So if you remember the fourth year's required coursework, so a mining student was required to take political economy. So this class was taught by Professor George Holmes Howison, who was the first professor of logic and philosophy at MIT. He was specifically hired by William Barton Rogers and Runkle to introduce the second half to the technical and vocational education, that is the civic and moral education. And you'll see highlighted, this is the examination that this class has to define labor and prove that the service of slaves or any other involuntary work is not labor in the economic sense, to state some of the principal advantages of division of labor, show its limitations, and point out some of its evil tendencies, which seem to be counteracted. So these students are discussing day in and day out these issues of labor, of slavery, of production, of labor, right? So I just want to emphasize that there's two parts to MIT's education, right? Not only are these students doing and seeing these new post-slavery issues that MIT and the nation is struggling to grapple with, but that they're also discussing this in class and approaching this from both the technical and the civic and moral side. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I'd like to invite Kelvin Green II to speak.
Good afternoon. In an attempt to understand MIT's relationship to slavery, I thought about the students. How were they interacting and thinking and perceiving race? And in seeking an answer to that question, I chose to look at racialized images in MIT student publications. So I looked at 30 volumes of The Tech, our student newspaper, as well as 14 volumes of Technique, our student yearbook. And when looking at these images, I was able to classify them into 3 categories, the first of which being waiters, the second being Klansman attire, Klansman referring to the Ku Klux Klan, and the third category being entertainment. So as we move to the category of waiters, the very first image of a black person to appear in an MIT student publication happens in 1883 in The Tech. This caption reading, "Hotel Modern, no fee, no dinner." And in analyzing this caption, we see there's a sort of resistance to changing times. This is about 20 years or so after the Civil War. We have the Reconstruction era, the aftermath of the Reconstruction era. And so this being the first image of a black person in an MIT student publication invites us and shows us that MIT is not in a vacuum. Students are interacting with the changing society around them. And this is one of the depictions of how they are doing so. I found 11 such images between the years that I viewed the images, and you have class dinners, you have cover pages of The Tech, and one of the cover pages I want to highlight, which happens in the 17th volume and the 13th issue. And to give, I would like to read the transliteration in order to provide further analysis. So I don't see why white people make so much fun of us colored people. One of the greatest men in the Bible was named Nicodemus. And this provides a series of issues. Not only does it implicitly state that black people are unintelligent, you can read the actual caption in its formatting. And not only does it implicitly state that black people are unknowledgeable about the Bible, but it also explicitly shows the internalization of the racial slur nigger as if that's how they view themselves. And so when you look at the series of images, I found 18, and 11 of them are waiters. It begs the question, is this an accurate representation of black male Bostonian occupations at this time? And that proves not to be true. Professor Adelaide M. Cromwell, who is professor emeritus at Boston University, did a study on the black male Bostonian occupations and studied their demographic. She not only highlights that at this time there's an overt conversation about waiters, but she also outlines that black males were not only waiters and laborers, but they were also barbers. They were tailors, they were carpenters, they were engineers, and they were students. And so out of the 18 images, I found 11 of which are waiters. None of them include black people as engineers, as students. We know that black people were attending MIT in some of the images that I found. And I'll go on into the further categories so we can further think about how they may have been interacting with knowing that this is how their school was representing them on a very mainstream scale. We move on to Klansman attire. So I found 3 such images. The first image on your far left is the cover image of a local society named DYDX. The second image is the cover page of the fraternities. All of these occur in Technique, the yearbook. And the third image is the cover page of the local society, so introducing the local societies. The first of which we see has just the Klansman hood, and in later images, they're now adorned with the white cloak. We know that the Ku Klux Klan, the role that they played in creating fear in the black community was prominent, and in other communities as well. They are symbols of white supremacy, of racial hatred, of violence, of rape, of murder. And these are the images that are being portrayed and clearly outlined in MIT student publications. Again, begging the question of, as we consider, is MIT being an inclusive environment at this time, how would black students have felt, or other students who were aware of Klan violence when seeing these images so publicly portrayed in their student publication? The third category of entertainment, I found 4 such images, and the last of which I want to highlight. I'll also note here that the sketch class in that third image of them drawing a black girl may very well be informed by the work that Alaisha pointed out and what they may have been being taught in some of their curriculum. But in this fourth image of a minstrel show, to provide context to those who are not aware, minstrel shows are racially charged forms of entertainment. Whether it's a musical or a play or a skit, white people would dress with blackface so that everyone is aware in the audience who they're portraying. And then they would act in certain ways to reinforce negative stereotypes of black people at this time. This being a full page in the yearbook, and this also occurring in the same year of the image that I outlined earlier with the conversation between the 2 black waiters and the racial slur involved. This behooves me to believe that a minstrel show was conducted on MIT's campus in this year. Further historical analysis will need to be done to prove if this is true. But the story does not start there. 100 years, this is 100 years into the future in 1989. There are a continuity of images, of such images that I've shown you, one of which being this image. And the conversation that's happening in the tech, which I'll outline more explicitly later, is around the Klansman hood that's used in this image. To provide context, in 1989, there's an event called Greek Fest that happens over a different number of years. But 1989 was special in that 1989 is special in that there was over-policing in the area. There were white Virginia Beach natives that were present. Greek Fest is a celebration where students of historically black colleges and universities, as well as members of black Greek organizations such as Alpha Phi Alpha and Alpha Kappa Alpha, would convene in Virginia Beach for celebration. But there was hostility, and there was rioting, and there was over-policing. And so this image is an attempt to put all those thoughts and those events into a still image in the tech. The caption reading, Lily White, the official suntan lotion of Virginia Beach. Lily White referring to the historical analysis of Lily White being a representation of racial hatred and disenfranchisement. So in response to this cartoon, an article was written by Dave Atkins, a graduate student class of 90. And he is a Virginia Beach native, and to give voice to the writings of the past, I would like to read the bolded text. And so he talks about how the conduct of the Virginia police was commendable. If anybody did the right thing, it was the police, who, faced with many opportunities to allow anger to encourage them to misuse their authority and power, chose restraint. He also ends his letter saying, what would those who feel they are not racist have us do? Surrender the streets to an angry mob? And so we see someone from Virginia Beach, a white male, is encountering with this story and responds to this cartoon. But the conversation doesn't stop there. A few issues later, Denelia Green, a graduate student class of 91, responds. And she's a black woman. She lived down the hall from Dave Atkins. And she writes, I would like to refute most of the comments made in Dave Atkins' recent letter. She talks about how the hotel owners had increased their rates and enforced minimum stays. She talks about how organized groups were not allowed to secure establishments for their meetings. She says the police on horse and foot paraded down Atlantic Avenue in riot gear. All that was needed was a riot. I know because I was there. She goes on further to state that race was an issue, as it was in the 60s. Perhaps he should have done the right thing and thought more carefully before commenting on the issue. Who knows? He may live next door to someone who would be able to give him an eyewitness account. And so we see in 1889 the first image of Klansman attire is featured in an MIT student publication with no black voices present. Given the socio-political climate at the time, most definitely not affirming how black people felt toward a certain event. However, 100 years later, we see an image that is now used to affirm how black people felt in response to an event, especially those who were there. And this rise of black voice and black agency in the same medium that was used in years prior, that excluded them in years prior. And so there's more work to be done, more images to be found. But in considering the question of MIT's relationship to slavery, it's important to consider the students' interactions with these things. And I think with more research done as it relates to the students, we can better understand MIT's relationship to slavery. Thank you. And now I would like to invite Professor Wilder, Archivist Murphy, and Dean Nobles back to the stage for the Q&A session.
Everyone. Hello. So we will now be starting our Q&A session. For the session, we'll have a few students standing by their microphones. Thank you all so much for volunteering. Thank you all. We ask that you prepare a single question with minimal background so we can ask as many as possible in the short time we have today. This is a topic that we could talk about for days, but we only have a few minutes. So forgive me if I very graciously give you the boot. All right, so we can begin with our first question. Yes, maybe.
When were the first African American students at MIT, and what do we know about what they have said or thought while they were students here?
All right, the archivist in the room, stand up. The first student to get a degree was Robert Robinson Taylor in 1892, and he was graduated in architecture. There are several other students who attended MIT probably a few years before him, and there are some afterwards, but there are not a lot. And as I think we all have indicated, there's a lot more research to do on all of these various questions. Every issue that the students looked at, there are just raised more questions in terms of who other people there are, who other people we need to look at and find more information about. So there are a few, but not very many.
Thank you so much. I'm so very moved by this work. My name is Michel de Graaf, and I'm from Haiti, and I teach here. And I was particularly moved by the students, because in 2018, so the work you're doing is so much at the antipodes of students in 1919. In particular, I'm thinking about the founding of this magazine that's still being published at MIT called Voodoo. And so in 1919, so the students wrote that, talking about voodoo, that the very name under which the being makes its appearance is clothed in mystery. For voodoo is that name given to certain magical practices, superstitions, and secret rites prevalent among the Negroes of the West Indies, and more particularly in Haiti. We did not, however, travel so far to find references to the voodoo in our own southern states before the Civil War. Voodooing was generally practiced.
I don't mean to cut you off, but yes. Could you ask?
So the question is, in the archives, for example, have you been able to find connections to the way voodoo was being produced, and how did black students feel, and what was the intent to make so much fun of a practice that of millions of Africans, both in Africa and in Haiti, in Brazil. So for me, it's something that's present because voodoo is still being published by Chas, for example. So any take on this question from the archives or from the students?
I think there are a few different answers to give you. One is that the continuing research of the class will actually examine the ways in which, as Kelvin's research started to do, African American and African diaspora cultures get consumed by students at MIT during these decades, right? How they actually get treated, characterized, and consumed, and then what the outcome of that is. And so it's one of the areas that we're looking actually to, as the class continues, to expand into. The other part is actually the more geographic. The connections between what we do at MIT and the Caribbean broadly, Francophone, Anglophone, and Hispanic Caribbean, to really think about, in fact, the international connections that shape the early intellectual and social culture of the Institute, the intellectual culture of the Institute in its formative decades. And we know, in fact, that that's actually a major part of both the economics of higher education in the second half of the 19th century when we're founded, but also, in fact, in the way in which knowledge is being produced.
We have a question from our online viewers.
Yes, so many people online have been asking whether this video will be available. It will be on the course website, by the way. So a question, many people have expressed that they are happy that MIT is choosing to share this history as it has a huge impact in our world. A question we have received, someone expressed that they are surprised that it took until now for information to be shared that Roger had slaves. What took so long?
Well, I can, if we're surprised by that, our surprise is a measure of how extraordinarily successful we've been as a nation at erasing the history of slavery. And we have been especially successful at erasing the history of slavery from the northeastern states, from, in fact, transforming that history into a history of relative benevolence. The narrative actually has taken a kind of perverse twist toward the just that actually has no real historical foundation at all. And so we're only starting to wrestle with, in fact, the intimate and relationship between the northern states and the institutions of the slavery economies of the Atlantic world. And the stories of universities are, in fact, just one part of that.
For people who don't know, Turner's painting, The Slave Ship, is in Boston at the Museum of Fine Arts. It's worth spending time with. I spend time with it every few years.
Was there any stated or public reaction by the faculty to the images that Kelvin showed us?
Has there been faculty? I believe that the images were shown to faculty, or maybe.
Is the question contemporaneously when they actually appeared in the at the time?
Yes,
during the time that they were actually
at the
shown?
time that they appeared.
Yeah.
Was there any faculty or other public reaction at MIT to these images?
So I would say further historical analysis is needed to be done to find the specific reactions to the images. I know that when I looked at the images in looking at all of the student publications and their issues, I didn't find any conversation when the certain cartoons were posted alongside. There was no piece alongside with reactions, but I think more needs to be done in searching that, and it's worth finding out what were the students' reactions, what were the faculty reactions. The fact that images have existed for so long that relate to certain stereotypes and such, there must not have been that much intervention in understanding maybe the negative role that the images were playing in the community, but more needs to be done to find out specifically how different members in the community were interacting with images.
What have these recent revelations meant for Black students here at MIT today?
I'll answer it. I'm not a Black student at MIT here today, but I'll answer it. I hope, in fact, that the history of MIT has an influence upon students at MIT broadly and upon the faculty and our alumni, et cetera, our various constituencies. I would remind us that, in fact, actually, the story of MIT and slavery is not actually African-American history. The fact that I'm Black and it's Black History Month shouldn't confuse us. The story of MIT and slavery is actually white history. It's the other 11 months of the year that it speaks to, because it speaks to, in fact, the very close relationship between historically white institutions and slavery. And so in part what's fascinating for me and what I hope we'll actually come away with is really a different understanding of or more central understanding of the way in which slavery played a core role in the development of the United States, and especially in the development of the northeastern states and their economies and institutions.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I mean, that was part of the reason why I provided the context as a way to say we shouldn't be surprised, right? That slavery was so fundamental to our country's history and its economy, its politics and such, that it would be surprising, in fact, that there were no connections. So as Craig said, part of, as we enter the 21st century, we are still, each generation, learning more about our country's history. And in a certain way, a famous historian, David Bryan Davis, described how the South may have lost the Civil War, but they won the narrative about slavery in the Civil War, right? And the erasure that Craig alluded to later is something that we are something that we are continuing to challenge. And this effort, I think, should be part of a much larger national conversation about how we think about our country's founding and its relationship to slavery. And the role that we're playing is one part of a much larger conversation.
I do want to add one other thing about what this might mean for students at MIT. And I think part of one way to think about it is across all the universities who have conducted investigations about the university's relationship to slavery, here at MIT, there's a prior question that needs to be addressed of who gets to narrate and write that. And there are different constituencies that can get involved. And I just want to highlight what has already been said to varying degrees, that, I mean, including students as part of that is critical. So this is one thing that I hope students will take away.
I don't know, I also wanted to add just to that question. As a black student at MIT, I feel like there are a lot of unspoken things that occur every single day at this institution that need to be addressed, and I bring those to the BSU. We bring those to our different black organizations, and to have this level of history, so that it's not just in our heads. These are things that we can point to. These are things that we can address as a community. It is not just the responsibility of the Black Students' Unions and the Political Action Committee. It is the responsibility of all of us as a community, and not just the Black students. So all of these things that we're learning, these conversations that are being had, the encouragement to go back and see these in your labs, to see these in your interactions with other people, and to see these here at MIT in your interaction with other institutions, it's not just an idle call to action. We're asking you to think, we're asking you to ask questions, and in that narrative that students are forming, please bring them to us. We want to make this something that is more fulfilled and give these stories more perspective, because history is not just the story of one perspective. It is a collaboration of several different ones.
And I'll just add that, how would you quantify the experiences felt by a black student seeing those images that I put up? How would you quantify that? It's hard. You get to ask, does it make you feel uncomfortable? You have a percentage, but then what does that mean? How there are different degrees of uncomfortableness. And so I would just like to stress the importance of qualitative analysis. There are stories, there are questions that you can ask. If you want to know how a black student feels at MIT, if you don't have a black friend, make a black friend. if you want to ask, but if you want to ask the question, get to know someone, increase dialogue, because you can't look at data to supplement necessarily the effects of racism. Sometimes you need to hear the stories, and they, in large part, are sometimes more important than the percentages you get back from a survey.
You're going to work for Shas.
Thank you all for your wonderful responses. Do we have another online question? Great.
So our comment and question from online is, too many universities and university students and alumni respond to the legacy of slavery in today's context rather than seeing it in the context of its time. While politically correct, it misinterprets and is historically incorrect. What gives anyone today the right to judge the actions of people in the distant past by modern popular moral standards?
Well, first, I'll answer that one. That's a good one. That's a good one to answer. First, your black friend should be voluntary. And then secondly, birth gives you the right to question slavery, to question history. That we're intelligent, thinking human beings. We are not actually held hostage by history. We have every right to look at the past. And the idea that to judge the past on modern values, moral values, is somehow ahistorical misunderstands what history is. History is, in fact, the science of really thinking about the past and how it influences the present, and historians make moral judgments constantly. We tend not to complain about them when they celebrate George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and we tend to protest when they start revealing uncomfortable truths. And so I have actually some sympathy for the questioner, but I think that the tension in that question is misplaced. I think we actually have to ask ourselves, what about this part of our past makes us so uncomfortable? And let's stick in that moment and deal with the discomfort rather than actually questioning the right of people to do history as a project. That's not the problem. The problem isn't that we're producing new historical narratives. The problem is actually that there's someone who has discomfort with it. And let's actually deal with the discomfort. We're capable of that. We're capable of actually thinking about the past in constructive ways. And one of the goals of the project is really to create the opportunities for us as a community, as communities, to wrestle with difficult issues in dialogue in a very extraordinarily democratic and open way.
I just want to add, one thing that Claire said to me was that there are several ways of containing this narrative, and one of those methods is confining it to the past. And so I think here we need to set that narrative free and realize that just because something is historically normalized does not make it good.
First of all, thank you so much for this. I find it really bewildering that no modern country, European or otherwise, has ever had a comprehensive reparations program, either for slavery or for the colonies. And when we think about the fact that we have someone in the White House now who celebrates white supremacist monuments and so on, we have to ask what can actually push our nation and the narrative in that other direction. And it seems like institutions have a big responsibility for that, and can, be a leader. So I wonder how you think that MIT can participate in the project of reparations in addressing these ties and in terms of reframing the narrative going forward.
I guess that means the dean talks. The issue of reparations, as you know, is a pretty complicated one. But I understand the sentiment. As I earlier said, one way that MIT is participating in helping the country rethink its history and looking at it in a much more complex way is through this project. Reparations that have succeeded in other countries are largely political projects, which means that ordinary citizens organize and make demands. They don't always succeed, and many times they don't, but they have to be popular efforts. To the degree that MIT is contributing to a greater public knowledge about the depths of our connections to slavery and what that may require of citizens going forward is a question that many American citizens will have to answer, and we are contributing to that conversation. So I think adding to the knowledge base is a pretty important part of this, and that's what we're doing.
Great, we'll take another online question.
Okay. With recent controversies surrounding taking down Confederate statues that are seen as glorifying slavery, how will you respond to those who want to discredit or take down the works of Rogers or other founders and leaders that have ties to slavery?
Well, I personally think those are two separate questions. One is the Confederate monuments and other monuments that actually celebrate, for instance, Native American massacres and other things. I have absolutely no nostalgia for American racism. It doesn't deserve my respect. It doesn't deserve any great attention from me except the historical narrative. And it doesn't erase history. In fact, removing those monuments is history. History is a record of change. And to the extent that we can remove things and explain and understand why that was done. Now, on the other hand, with people like Rogers, and I don't think that, my sense is that the goal of this project, the goal of our work collectively, is not actually to remove Rogers, it's actually to tell his story in the most honest, complicated, full, transparent way that we can. And if we do that well, we will create the space, in fact, for much better conversations on our campuses, in our cities, in our states, and in our nation, for conversations about race, social justice, inclusion, diversity. What all of those things actually really mean can't be understood when we're standing in front of a false historical backdrop.
And I think that one of the ways in which I think about this is that you have to, in addition to being honest, you have to claim that space. We understand the Black Students Union is housed in Walker Memorial, named after Francis Walker, who had racist views. And I understand that that we just had the Multicultural Conference in Endicott House, the MIT mansion that was funded by money made from cotton. And so we understand that certain things happen in certain buildings in certain contexts, but we have to call attention to them. So maybe you don't take something down. I know there's a story of, there's this road in South Carolina that you have a Confederate statue that sits on Martin Luther King Boulevard. I mean, whether you take it down or you call attention to it, it's important to be honest about that narrative. And that's one way that you can deal with the history of the past. Yeah.
Any other comments from the panelists?
Rogers is also just one character in this entire narrative, right? So for example, the second president of MIT, John Daniel Runkle, during the Civil War, he actually volunteered as part of the Freedmen's Aid Society to help mobilize teachers to educate newly freed slaves. George Holmes Howison, as I mentioned earlier, the first professor of philosophy and logic, his parents actually randomly decided to uproot their family and free all their slaves. And he was brought up in that situation, right? So Rogers and Walker and Runkle and Howison, they're all moving parts of this entire puzzle, right? Like, narratives aren't just one character in one situation, right? We have to look at a collection of all these people representing MIT.
There's a saying that when lions have historians, hunters will cease to be heroes. So I'd like to thank you for giving voice to the lions in the work that you are doing, but I also would like to thank the hunters for laying down your weapons and engaging in conversation.
What would you say are the implications of your project and what you're finding for the teaching of science, but also the teaching of history of science? Because when science is taught and when history of science is taught, it's what you're describing is generally stripped out. It's not leave aside research. It's just, I don't remember learning in the history of science that I ever did some of these things. There's a fantastically triumphalist narrative in terms of how science is often taught.
I think there are many different implications about that. And the tendency, right, as we think about science and technology, and that became the center of our discussions in the classrooms of how to talk about it. The tendency is to isolate it and treat it as something that is, neutral, these transparent, these different variations. But as I think I want to underscore what the presentations have shown, right? Like Alaisha's attention to the language of slavery and human bondage being invoked to talk about scientific, talking about zoology, about the ants. It makes attention to the language and to the practice and to the work makes us realize that, scientific knowledge is actually embedded very much in this social context. You can't treat it alone. But it's not just about science. This also goes back to MIT as an institution. We also have a tendency to treat MIT as isolated from these otherworldly things. And so it's our obligation, we're accountable and responsible for thinking differently and trying to complicate that. And I think it'll be, these are very much the things on my mind as I think about what to do next in the classroom.
And that's one of the things that's particularly powerful about MIT's investigation into this is that unlike a lot of other institutions that have started to look at their own history in this context, we have a very different role. We were founded more recently in Boston. We're a science and technology institution. So I think all of those facts mean that MIT's investigation sets an important precedent for other colleges that are science and technology oriented or were founded recently in the North to also sort of show that this narrative and this connection to slavery is very nuanced and that science and technology are an aspect that can no longer be left to the wings.
Right, and with that, we will end our Q&A session, but we won't end the conversation surrounding this topic. Again, I'd like to thank you all and panelists and all the volunteers and everyone who helped to put this event together. It is important for us to be mindful of the power structures that established our institution and affect our experiences even today. I urge all of the MIT community to keep this dialogue continuing. Please enjoy refreshments and introduce yourselves to someone you haven't met before.